I'm Greg Johnson. I'm a retired conservation officer at Idaho Fish and Game. I've worked up in the Selkirks and the Cabinets, Boundary County for 31 years. Retired in 2014. So, when I came here, they were first discussing the caribou augmentations. That was just getting up on the table, the project, and so in on the early stages of that and those discussions and planning meetings, recovery meetings for caribou, and eventually resulted in the augmentation that they did, 2 different augmentations in Idaho and Washington back in the late 80s, early 90s. So had not seen caribou in the Selkirks prior to the augmentations. Once those happened, then we, I was in a lot of recovery efforts of mortality, caribou that died either from natural causes or predation.
You said that most of the mortalities were from predation, so...
Right. Yeah, so early on, the focus was pretty much on habitat. Do we have enough habitat to support caribou? And the short answer is yes, in a limited number, but there was certainly enough habitat to support what they were going to bring down in the augmentation effort and for some population growth thereafter for quite a while. The one thing that was unforeseen is, they knew caribou had a pretty low natality rate. They weren't very great producers, and so the thing that kind of we missed was the fact that the habitat had changed enough to the point where other ungulates on the forest, deer, elk, and moose, were in much greater numbers than they were historically, and with that came predators. The prey base was there to support a much larger predator population. And that came as a bit of a surprise. As soon as we got caribou on the ground and they were doing their thing, we started seeing mortalities, and primarily by lions. I would say, 90% of it was from lions. We certainly had some that we couldn't distinguish, what the cause of death was once, we got to the animal and investigated, but bears had scavenged the carcasses, things like that. But for the most part, knowing, how bears make their living, how lions make their living, lions were the primary cause of mortality of caribou in the Selkirks for many years after the augmentation, and probably the single thing that caused their eventual elimination completely. And just there are certainly other causes. Roadkill, incidental poaching now and then, things like that, but lions were the big impact, and that was just something that, in hindsight's 2020, you could, no one predicted it, but it became pretty evident fairly quickly. And at the time, there just wasn't, there was a solution to that, but there was no will to get it done, and that was to initiate a predator control program, focused specifically on lions in the areas where they needed to, and there just was not there wasn't the will amongst the agencies, coordination, and any real effort to get that done. No one wanted to touch it. So from that point on, it was pretty well doomed. And even with that, by the time we did the augmentation in Washington, pretty well established what the cause of death was amongst the transplant animals, and it was predation, and no one had done a single thing to solve that, and we went right into the next augmentation program with the same results. So yeah, didn't see it coming, but once it was there, didn't seem to want to do anything about it. That's
what were the main, if you could just describe the main factors contributing to the loss of habitat originally?
Well, there's the 2 primary factors that changed the habitat to such a large degree on a landscape basis were the fires in the 60s, Trapper Creek, Sundance Burns, 60s, early 70s. Some smaller fires along the way as well. Those were landscape changing fires, especially in the Selkirks. On top of that, fairly aggressive logging program over, from the 30s on up. That was certainly more regulated by the time we were looking at caribou augmentations, but the habitat had changed by then. So the amount of old growth had been greatly reduced. The fires had created, a forest. Fires and logging had created a forest that was in a sterile stage that basically made it much more accommodating for other ungulates, deer, elk, moose, to occur in much greater numbers. So with those, you had the eventual increase in predator populations, primarily lions. Wolves really didn't come on the scene until the late 90s, early 2000s. So lions were the primary predator species, for a big game animal or a large ungulate in the Selkirks during that period. And caribou did not have what you'd call a good strategy for evading lions. Deer and elk move up and down summer to winter, so the lions would stay with those other ungulates through the winter season down low, and as they went back up, the lions just went with them. And when they did that, they encountered the caribou. And I investigated many mortalities where a caribou had been taken out by a lion, and the other caribou were still in the neighborhood, and the lion's still there. Mm-hmm. And so it just was a recipe for disaster for the caribou, unfortunately. And there was not, caribou management really needed to be happening with a long-term management plan, 50-year, 100-year management plan. The agencies tended to want to look at a 5 to 10-year management plan and trying to do what they could in those periods, which is certainly not long enough when you're talking about trying to change the age of the forest and to change predator populations or populations of other ungulates. It's just not going to happen in 5 to 10 years. So all those things combined just made a recipe for failure for those augmentations. And like I said, hindsight's 20/20, but once they saw it, no one seemed to want to do much about it. They just let it keep happening, and there was no real plan to solve that. They could adopt a forest plan and with good intent to increase old growth across the landscape, but absent having 100 years to do that and being able to keep caribou alive during that time, it was doomed to failure. So.